Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 65th episode of the Atlas Society Asks. My name is Jennifer Angie Grossman. My friends know me as JAG. I am the CEO of the Atlas Society. We are the leading nonprofit organization connecting young people with the ideas of Ayn Rand. Today, we are joined by Brian Yablonski. Before I even begin to introduce Brian, I want to remind all of you who are joining us via Zoom, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube. You know what to do. Start typing in your questions using the comment section, and we will get to as many of them as possible. So Brian Yablonski is the Chief Executive Officer of the Property and Environment Research Center, fondly known to all of us as PERC. That is a Bozeman, Montana-based research institute exploring free market environmentalism with a focus on land management and wildlife conservation. Previously, Brian served as the chairman of the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission for more than 14 years, earning recognition from Florida's Wildlife Federation as Florida's Wildlife Conservationist of the Year, and the Florida Audubon with the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Award. His work has spanned the private sector, holding senior positions at the Gulf Power Company and the St. Joe Company, one of Florida's largest private landowners at the time. Brian and I both worked in the Bush 41 administration, where he helped craft, and he also then worked for Florida Governor Jeb Bush and helped craft environmental and conservation policy in that administration. So a lot in common. Brian, welcome again. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jennifer. How are you? Can I call you Jag?
Please do. You're a friend.
Well, you had a much more important job in the White House than I did, because I know you were doing speech writing, and I think I was helping the president manage his horseshoe pitching matches out there. So
yeah, well, you probably, in the Bush 41 administration, all of the speechwriters were a little bit downgraded from the role of speechwriting in the previous administration. And so you probably had a lot more access to the president than we did. And I started out as a very, very lowly researcher, and then just worked all the time, wrote anything I could. And so, anyway, yes, and it's too bad we didn't meet then, but here we are. However many
almost
years
30 years later.
Yeah.
I think we both figured out we started the White House the same month after college. That's pretty cool.
That's pretty amazing. What a privilege and an honor that was. Yeah. So you have described yourself as a conservation optimist in contrast to the more Malthusian perspective that certainly dominates many Earth Day observances and the news coverage with dire predictions of imminent doom. So what are some examples that give you grounds for optimism?
Yeah, well, thanks. I do call myself a conservation optimist, and there aren't many of us around, in case you haven't noticed, out there in the real world. But, if you think about it, I mean, some of it's a matter of perspective. Where I live, Montana, is spectacular. I mean, it is gorgeous. We have clean air, we have clean water. I go outside. I have a little cabin in a place called Paradise Valley here. It's actually it's supposed to be the setting for the TV show Yellowstone, where that stars Kevin Costner. And I go out at night, and the stars, everybody goes out and they look for the Big Dipper. I can't pick out the Big Dipper because there are so many stars in the sky. It like overshadows a lot of the constellations that we're familiar with. So part of it is living in Montana and actually being a part of nature and not doing it from a city, and seeing, how spectacular our landscape is and what a good job America has done in protecting and conserving some of our vital places. Think about where we were 50, 100 years ago. We had clear cutting of our forests. We had wildlife that was dwindling. Populations were in jeopardy. We had sort of blatant pollution of air and water. And you look at today, I think about wildlife rebounding, out here. We have white-tailed deer. Everybody's familiar with white-tailed deer. At one point, white-tailed deer in America were down to 300,000. Today, we're up to 32 million white-tailed deer. I mean, that's the amount of white-tailed deer in the United States that we had at the time of Lewis and Clark and their expedition out west. Bison, the national mammal, we got down to fewer than 1,000 bison at the turn of the last century, and we're up to 500,000 bison today. Most of those bison, 90% of those bison, are on private lands. They're in private ranches, and it's been private property, private ranchers that have helped the bison recovery. Elk, we were down to 100,000. We're at 1 million elk. Wild turkey. Everybody sees wild turkey these days. We were down to like 30,000 wild turkey in the early 20th century. We have 7 million wild turkey now. So you have these really great wildlife stories that never get talked about. Grizzly bears in Yellowstone are 7 times, 8 times their number than when they went on the endangered species list. The bald eagle's off the endangered species list. Great wildlife stories. I talk about carbon emissions. I mean, everybody wants to talk about climate change and carbon emissions. And the story that never gets told is that thanks to the entrepreneurship and technology associated with hydraulic fracking and horizontal drilling of shale gas, we've had this shale gas revolution. So we've essentially moved a lot of our energy footprint from coal to natural gas and from oil to natural gas. And as a result of that, total carbon emissions in the United States are down to their levels that we were emitting back in the early 1990s. So think about that. Our total emissions of carbon today is the same as what it was in the 1990s. And we added about 65 or 70 million people who are driving cars, who are using air conditioning, who are using energy. That's all natural gas. That's a big function of kind of the innovation that went with natural gas and with energy efficiency technologies that folks are able to monitor more at their homes and thermostats, and you have the Nest technology. Reforestation in the United States. People think of forests like, oh, we're growing, we're developing. But our forests, we have about 760 million acres of forests in America. That's the same amount of forest land we had 100 years ago. And 60% of that's privately owned. So that's another private, stewardship model out there. So there are stories like this on and on that I can tell that just don't get covered. It doesn't make for good news, but we are doing a good job with conservation in America, and that's why I'm positive about it. And I'll be out there preaching that gospel.
Yeah, well, we've had our friends John Tierney on, who talks about the power of bad, that we're kind of wired to look for the negative and for threats. And then, of course, the media is constantly trying to alarm us, with what's going wrong. It's more newsworthy. And so I think we do get a skewed picture and don't necessarily take into account all of this progress, and pause for a moment with gratitude for how much progress we've made. And to build on that progress, you favor an approach of free market environmentalism. What is it, and what are some examples of that approach at work?
Yeah, so you have to know the history of PERC. So PERC was founded 40 years ago by a handful of outdoor-loving economists. So our original name was not the Property and Environment Research Center; it was the Political Economy Research Center. And then I tell the story for about 30 minutes in the middle there, our board decided that PERC would stand for protecting the environment through ruthless capitalism. And then they came to their senses after about a half hour, and we became the Property and Environment Research Center about 30 years in. But our background's economics, and economists, if you know economists, they look at incentives. They believe incentives matter, and getting the incentives right is a key part to getting conservation right. And one way that we've kind of espoused doing conservation, which is a little different than the Malthusian model potentially here, is that we think we should incentivize conservation through markets and property rights. That is a positive incentive. It's voluntary, it's cooperative, it's based on exchange to get the right outcomes. Trade, if you have a property right and you're the person that somebody wants to do the conserving, somebody can pay you for that. There's an exchange there. The alternate model is political environmentalism, and that's where you have regulation and litigation and more legislation. That may be incentive based, but it's negative incentives. I mean, you're essentially being punished. It's force, it's not carrot to get you there. And what you find is, from administration to administration, if you rely on the political environmentalism model, it changes. I mean, you look at some of the environmental issues of the last decade, Bears Ear National Monument in Utah, like everybody knows Bears Ears now. President Obama declares it a monument. Trump undeclares it a monument. Biden's going to redeclare it a monument. You have this with carbon rules. You have this with waters of the U.S. rules, where you get political whiplash, and it's I win, you lose, and it's not sustainable. But if you can make conservation make economic sense for the person that you want to do the conserving, if you make conservation an asset instead of a liability, that's free market environmentalism, and that's more durable and that's more sustaining. So go ahead.
Yeah. So one of the issues, speaking of political whiplash and things that Biden, has reversed from the previous administration, one of those changes was the Keystone pipeline and Biden's revoking of the permit needed for a U.S. stretch of the 1,200-mile project. What's your view of that decision? Is it going to be a good thing for the environment? Was that an environmental threat, or were there other considerations such as Native American opposition that were at play? And
Keystone's a big deal in Montana. I think that the problem, Keystone is political environmentalism. I mean, I think people stopped looking at the facts and determining whether, think about it. If you're not moving crude through a pipeline, you're moving it through rail cars, right? Is that any safer to be moving, oil across the country in trucks or rail cars versus a pipeline? If you looked at just kind of the science of it, moving that through the United States via pipeline is probably a safer and more environmentally sound way than the other alternatives. The problem is nobody even thinks about anymore. Keystone, all you say is Keystone, and you instantly have political polarization, and you have actions based on that. So I firmly believe, President probably in that particular case was playing to, that's the base, like that's the symbolic thing that he had to do, whether he wanted to or not. The other thing, Keystone was one of those. The Alaska National Wildlife Refuge is one of those too. That's been playing out, Jennifer, since we were in the White House. The question is, are we going to drill in the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge? Is it safe to drill? What impact would it have for species? And that has been political whiplash. But one of the things that PERC in that particular case has looked at is, could you have a market-based solution? And perhaps the Biden administration might embrace this. But think about this. The Trump administration put 500,000 acres out to bid for drilling, for lease rights to drill in the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. The bids came in, and the winning bid was $14 million. $14 million to drill in the refuge. That amount of money has been spent many times over 50 years of lobbying and politically posturing by conservation groups and others on this issue. If the conservation groups were allowed to bid to retire leases, to not drill, something we call non-use rights, in a true market-based sense, they could have raised $15 million and won the rights to not drill there. So, the market can actually work for conservation if allowed to. The way the laws are set up today, they're not allowed to do that. So it's a use it or lose it proposition. If you bid on an oil and gas project, you got to use the oil and gas. But in a true market, I think it'd be fascinating to see what would happen. The Alaska National Wildlife Refuge doesn't have to be a political issue. It can be a market issue, and the highest bidder determines what happens with the refuge.
Got it. I want to remind everyone who's watching on our various social media platforms, including all of our loyal crew who always signs up for us here on the Zoom webinar. Please start teeing up your questions. This is a really unique opportunity. So go ahead, type them in. We'll get to as many of them as possible. And it's interesting, Brian, because we've had a couple of webinars recently. I think we had Stephen Koonin last week. He actually was in the Obama administration as Undersecretary of Science of the Environment, and he wrote a book called Unsettled about what we know, what we don't know about climate change. And then we also had Michael Schellenberger on the show, who wrote Apocalypse Never. So I know that PERC focuses more on land management and wildlife conservation, but do you guys have a perspective in terms of prioritizing climate change? Grabs all of the headlines, as you mentioned. Is it the number one threat? It certainly isn't the only threat. And what are, if it's not, what are some of the issues that you feel need some more attention that the whole climate change debate might be crowding out?
No, I mean, and climate change, I mean, look, we believe it, climate change is real and it needs to be addressed. And it is a significant issue, but it's so intertwined with all these other issues. As you mentioned, we're very focused on land, water, and wildlife. And climate change as an issue sometimes is not the core issue threatening those elements, but sometimes has a tendency to magnify, amplify, and expand those problems. You know, it can exacerbate. So look at a big problem in addition to climate change is habitat loss, right? And habitat loss, if you look at it, can be like fragmentation and development and loss of land as a result of that. But in the case of wetlands, it could be rising sea levels that could be related to climate change, that could consume habitat, you know, through rising sea levels too. It's kind of a mixed problem. Some of that's climate change, some of that's not climate change. Forests, which I think we'll get into, it's kind of the same issue. You know, like there's an element of climate change there, but there's some big problems that predate any of the issues related to climate change that are really impacting forest health these days. So it's complicated. We tend to focus on land, wildlife, and water issues because that's our core. Like that's what we've done for 40 years. And to the extent there's some infusion of climate change issues into that, you know, we definitely want to address those things. We tend to be focused more on things like market-based adaptation to climate change. I think Schellenberger is a great example. He's been a thought leader in this area. You know, it's interesting because there's no silver bullet to climate change. I think that's what we're finding right now. And I think it's fine. There's a lot of trade-offs, to use an economics term, for how we address this. We can move away from fossil fuel and put up windmills and a huge vast array of solar fields, but there's a consumption of land, you know, that goes to habitat fragmentation and a significant issue there. And we are moving away from fossil fuels. That was a market-based, property rights-based move to shift more to natural gas. But to Schellenberger's point, you know, if we were really serious about climate change, we would be focusing on nuclear. Like it is the largest baseload generation. And so you have to wonder, like, to the extent this is a really big issue, it needs big, serious market-based solutions, not sort of top-down regulatory-based solutions. And would seem like it would gravitate us to nuclear energy as a better solution at the end of the day. So
yeah, and I think it needs proper science. It needs a accurate and not an alarmist approach to interpreting what we're measuring, and also a better predictions about the future. So,
well, truth in advertising also, you know, because, you know, we can all say there's climate change and we can all agree with that, or most can agree with that. The question is, what do you do, right, at the end of the day? And there has to be sort of truth in advertising in terms of what is if you go down one road and it's heavy top-down response and sort of clamping down on the economy and making societies poorer, what are we going to get out of that? Like, what's the temperature change we're going to get? Like, how are we going to stem this? And I think the debate's been sort of lacking on the trade-off side of it, because I think people are honest. They want to address climate change, but they want to know at what cost. You know, what are the trade-offs here? And folks can make better informed decisions that way.
So I remember, I think it was at an SPN conference when I walked by a PERC table and picked up a wonderful booklet that you guys had on wildfires and land management. And that was particularly interesting to me because this house is one that I rebuilt in 2007 after a fire, which actually it was exacerbated by the Santa Ana winds, but it was started by arson. So, as mentioned, a lot of the talk and coverage of recent fires have been kind of pressed into the service of climate change alarmism, but and there's not much conversation about what are some of the other policies, maybe they're government policies, environmental policies, that should be the focus of some of the more direct causes and accessible solutions.
Yeah, no, well, and you're living it, like your backyard is ground zero for what we're experiencing. I mean, fires they're larger, they're more devastating than they've been at any time in the past. The fire season these days is 80 days longer than it was in 1970. You think about 2020 and what we just came through in the rearview mirror and what we're in today. I mean, we lost 10 million acres of forest land to fires in 2020, which was a record for modern history. So this is a huge issue. It tends to be postured as an either or issue. There are a lot of folks that say, hey, it's climate change. And if you don't, address climate change, you're not going to solve the wildfire problem. What's interesting is that a couple of years ago, there were Forest Service scientists that went out to study what were the drivers of wildfire severity out there. And they looked at 4 factors. They looked at climate was one of the factors. They looked at topography. They looked at something called fire weather. So fire weather would be like wind speeds and humidity, things like that. And they looked at live fuel, what was on the forest floor already. And then they gave a percent, like what was the cause of wildfire severity. Interestingly, climate was only 14% is what they found out. The largest driver of wildfire severity was live fuel on the forest floor. It was 53%. 53%, more than all the others combined, was live fuel. And the solution to that is more forest management. So, and more forest management, the Forest Service, our public lands, our public forests, we have 193 million acres of national forest. 63 million of those acres are in high or severe risk of wildfire at this point. They need cleaned out. They need managed. Nature used to do this. We stopped nature from doing this. There's a whole history of fire suppression. This is essentially a man-made thing, and it goes back 100 years. So this is really about policies that were created back when the Forest Service was founded in the early 1900s. Not as much about climate change, and addressing climate change could be important, but you've got all this fuel in the forest right now that needs to be managed and needs to be addressed, or these massive conflagrations are just going to continue to happen.
Why isn't it being managed? Is it just that the forest services and agencies aren't doing a good job of it? Are there particular policies which are preventing it, saying you can't do controlled burns because it's this particular species that's going to be impacted?
Yeah, government, it's interesting. The history of government here, like government has there's been a lot of mismanagement of our forests when it comes to government. And it's not like intentional mismanagement. It's just, you look back at it. I mean, government has their fingerprints kind of all over the forest problem. Primarily 2. One was a policy of fire suppression that we talked about that goes back 100 years. The other is regulations that are set up that actually impede the ability to do restoration projects on our forest lands right now. So, but to take us back to the first problem, how we got here, interestingly, this government created phenomena started back in 1910. There was a fledgling, agency, a bureaucracy that was created called the Forest Service. It was run by a forester named Gifford Pinchot, and he wasn't quite sure like what they were supposed to do. You know, they had these lands that Theodore Roosevelt had brought into public force, and they had this body of lands there. In 1910, there was a massive wildfire out here in Montana and Idaho called the Big Burn. 3 million acres burned, 87 people were killed in the fire. And Gifford Pinchot had this epiphany that, you know, the Forest Service had a new mission, and the new mission was to eliminate wildfire. And the new edict was, you know, if you see a fire, it is to be put out by 10 a.m. the next morning. That was the edict out there. So for 100 years, we had Smokey the Bear policy, right? Everybody knows Smokey the Bear. Only you can prevent forest fire. So all of the government resources have gone into just stopping fire. And, you know, has led up to this huge buildup of, you know, what I say is we have too much wood in the woods at this point. You think about tree mortality that's out there. You know, back in the 1950s, we had 1 billion board feet of tree mortality. These days, it's like 4 billion board feet of tree mortality. We're not thinning the forest enough. So if you think of a problem that we're having is the ability to do forest harvests. And in the 1988, we were harvesting like 12 billion board feet of forest. Today, we only harvest something like 3 billion board feet of forest. So, you know, 100 years of suppression has led to tons of undergrowth that has created this live fuel process. Compounding the problem is that when the government does go out and suppress and fight these fires as aggressively as they had, you create a moral hazard or essentially a subsidy. So people build, if the government's going to come and save your house, you build in risky areas, right? It's like National Flood Insurance Program. You know what? You're just going to keep rebuilding in the flood zone because government's there as the backstop to cover your losses. And then the important thing, so that's kind of a second way that government kind of gets it wrong, is the process for doing forest restoration has to go through, as you know, a NEPA review process. This is like environmental permitting. And that can be just get caught in like permitting hell. Like that can take years and years to get through this process. You have to go through Endangered Species Act consultation. So we have a project here in Bozeman that is up in the mountains. We have a reservoir. We have forests around there. If there's a forest fire up there, all that sediment's going to go into the reservoir. It's going to jeopardize the drinking water in Bozeman. So there's been an effort to try to do some thinning, some good management of the forest out there to mitigate the risk of forest fire. That project just broke ground. It's been 20 years in the making, 20 years, and 20 years to get through the permitting process, 20 years to get through endangered species consultation. Crazy that it takes that long. So government puts up these roadblocks. You mentioned controlled burns. So controlled burns are supposed to mimic nature. We talked about suppressing nature. Low intensity fires are actually pretty good for the forest. You want to kind of clear the underbrush with these low intensity fires so you don't have these big crown fires. They get up into the branches and really spread the forest fire. And controlled burns, which for your listeners don't know, that's where you go out and intentionally do a managed fire, a low intensity burn to get rid of that underbrush, actually creates a healthier forest floor. It creates healthier habitat, healthier soil all the way around. The science on that is rock solid. Everybody will tell you that's the way to go. The Clean Air Act, so it's the federal act. Every state has an emissions standard that they have to adhere to. And it's a level of emissions that they can put out. When a wildfire hits, the Clean Air Act says, no, that doesn't count. That's nature. That doesn't count against your emissions. But if you want to do a controlled burn, the emissions from that counts against your cap. So in trying to save the forest by using fire, you're actually penalized and you can actually exceed your cap. And if you exceed your state cap, you know, all kinds of regulations go in place. So, you know, the Clean Air Act actually discourages good, clean air policy at the end of the day.
Wow.
Yeah.
What are, we're going to get some of our questions from our viewers. So I want to encourage those watching to continue to type them in there. But what are some other examples of government policies that are actually counterproductive? And you gave an example of a policy that was supposed to help the environment and help clean air that's hurting it, but like agricultural subsidies.
Yeah, agriculture. I mean, ethanol subsidies and biofuel subsidies are huge. I mean, it drives farmers to plant crops and corn when maybe that land could be used for conservation and for other purposes and for wildlife habitat. But government artificially is pushing for land consumption in that case. Wind and solar subsidies in the energy area, which are out there getting, wind and solar kind of get this most favored nation status when it comes to energy. And for a wildlife, manager like me and somebody who's managed wildlife, I mean, there are, again, goes back to trade-offs. I mean, that is consumption of land, which is consumption of habitat, which isn't good for the environment. So while you're probably having a minuscule impact on the climate, you're having a massive negative impact on habitat.
All right, we want to turn from forests to waterways. Kathleen Westbrook, Wisconsin Native American, says she is working to protect water in her state. What are some of the ways that that your organization is pursuing as market-based free market initiatives?
Yeah, great question. I mean, water markets are an awesome way to protect water, and PERC has been involved at the start of that and trying to get that right. For the way it works out west, so eastern United States and western United States are different, but in the western United States, water is a private property right. There's actually ownership, and it has to do with when the homesteaders and settlers came in, and ranchers and farmers, they actually got to own the water. It was called first in time, first in use. And so one of the things I've had to experience since I've moved from Florida to Montana is water rights. Like farmers and ranchers have a property right to water that they can irrigate their field and feed their cattle, feed their cattle with. That water always had to be used for a beneficial use. That's what the law said. And a beneficial use was only agriculture at the end of the day. So for the rancher, it was use it or lose it. The rancher either had to put the water on their field, use it for agriculture, or somebody else would get their water right, or their water right would be diminished. One of the ways that we kind of turned that on the head and had the property rights and markets work for the benefit of conservation of water is to change the laws in the state to define beneficial use as conservation also. So it just didn't have to go to agriculture. A beneficial use of your water right could be for conservation. Now, how does that come into play? Well, if you think about a stream or a river here, where you want to keep strong water flows going in the river for habitat purposes, for fish, for trout, for salmon, when you made that change to legislation, you create a water market. So organizations like Trout Unlimited now come forward and they negotiate with ranchers and they say, rancher, you don't need all your water allocation. What if we buy or lease some of your water to actually keep it in the river or in the stream? So that's inflow, they call that inflow conservation protection, because we want to keep the water good. We want to make sure there's enough good water there. And we also want to keep the fish healthy and all the species that rely on healthy water systems. So those water market transactions are happening all throughout the West, and they're really having success. And ranchers are getting compensated. It's getting the incentive right. A rancher now says, well, I could use my water inefficiently, but if I use my water efficiently and I free some up, I could sell it for conservation and get revenue that way. So it really gets the incentive right. One thing we want to start looking at that I know some organizations are looking at is groundwater, not water in rivers, but water underground in aquifers. And currently there is no property rights mechanism for that. But if we could create a property rights mechanism on groundwater, you could essentially create a whole other water market, that uses the power of water as a property right to actually get good conservation outcomes.
Interesting. Well, you mentioned Trout Unlimited, an organization my father is involved with. Scott on YouTube was also asking if there are other groups that you work with, Center for Industrial Progress. And I'm wondering also, there are sort of the big organizations that we hear about, the wildlife conservation, the Audubon. Like, are there other groups that are sympathetic to the kind of approach? Are you guys out there kind of on your own? How much of your work is just trying to maybe even change the culture? Are these groups sort of relying on, hey, give us money and we'll go lobby the government to do more regulations? So yeah, give us a bit of The
Yeah.
landscape.
Yeah. So I used to say like PERC back at its origins was a voice in the wilderness when it came to this. People looked at free market environmentalism and thought it was an oxymoron, and they thought our founders were the moron part of the oxymoron, is what they used to say. But I think what we've become over the years is kind of a leading voice in trying to change the way some of the other organizations think. I mean, we put a big priority in reaching out to other conservation organizations to partner with them. And I'll give you a couple examples. Environmental Defense Fund. So Environmental Defense Fund based there in California and in New York. We worked with them on rights-based fisheries. So we have had a problem with overfishing in the waters of the United States, halibut in Alaska, red snapper in Florida. And the way those fisheries are set up, or used to be set up, is commercial fishing boats would go out in the beginning of the year and they would start to fish, and government would say, you have a limit on your fish. Let's say it's 1 million pounds of fish. And they had to keep trip tickets. So when they came back from their trips, they had to report how many fish, electronically that they had caught. When you got to that 1 million pounds collectively, the government shuts the fishery down, right? So sometimes if you wanted red snapper in Florida, it wasn't available after April or after May because it had already been fished out, and you had to get your fish, you had to get your famous snapper from Mexico. So Environmental Defense Fund and PERC worked on these ideas of, well, we know how many fish the fishermen catch. Like, we have their landings year after year. Why don't we give them a property right to that and let them buy, sell, and trade? And then they can take that property right and fish it the entire year. There's no race. There's no derby. This is the classic tragedy of the commons, right? So if nobody owns it, it's like a derby. Everybody races to consume the resource that nobody owns because somebody else will get it if you don't get it. Once we give a property right to folks, then it kind of flattens out. There's more efficient use, and you don't have to go out and buy 50 boats to fish your fish. You can fish them on the 5 boats. You don't have to go out in a hurricane to fish your fish because you have a property right to it. And if somebody else wants more fish, you negotiate, you buy, sell, and trade. And the cool thing is, if the fishery gets healthier because you're being a better steward, your percentage of the fishery is going to mean more fish. So let's say your property right, your catch share is what it's called, is 2% of the fishery. Well, 2% of a healthy fishery is going to keep growing. So bring it back. Environmental Defense Fund took a leap in kind of partnering with us. We took a leap in partnering with Environmental Defense Fund in helping to implement some of those systems across the United States. So that's been a really great partnership. I talked to Fred Krupp, their CEO, every so often. We are looking at things related to monarch butterfly migrations and paying landowners for creating milkweed habitat, in the heartland. So I think what you've seen is some of these groups, the Nature Conservancy, Audubon is certainly in this camp too, are starting to recognize the value of markets and property rights and private land stewardship. And PERC is kind of helping move that dialogue and helping them get there. And it doesn't mean the old model doesn't exist and there isn't money going to go do regulation and legislation and all those things. But to us, it's a success that a lot of these organizations are recognizing that, hey, if you can get this done through markets and property rights, first, that's going to be a more sustainable, durable form of conservation than the political whiplash.
I think the only regulation I might be in favor of is banning leaf blowers. Though I'm sure if I could work with PERC, you guys could, we could come up with some leaf blowing.
You can negotiate with the leaf blowing commandos out there.
Yeah, but my bet's going to be on technology. We're going to have a quieter leaf blower technology in the future.
I think, by the way, something really cool that's happening in your neck of the woods. I just remembered this. In California, up in the Central Valley, we talk about like the Nature Conservancy, and they're being more willing to try market-based solutions. But you have a lot of shorebirds that migrate along the coast of California, and a lot of them would come through the Central Valley. And the Central Valley is like a big rice growing place. And the shorebirds need wetlands to rest in. So there's this program that the Nature Conservancy created called Bird Returns. Mm-hmm. We call them pop-up wetlands, where the Nature Conservancy raises private money and then negotiates with rice farmers to where rice farmers would normally drain their fields at a certain time of year. They actually pay rice farmers to keep their fields wet and in water so that the birds have an artificial wetland to kind of come into as part of their migratory pattern. And they actually do it as like a reverse auction. So they put it out to bid, and the low bid gets the pop-up wetland payment from private donors at the end of the day. So, it's an example of the Nature Conservancy thinking very PERC-like in how they're engaging in conservation.
I love it, and I love the partnership strategy that is in the DNA of the Atlas Society. And we're kind of niche. Ayn Rand objectivism, open objectivism in particular, and just finding ways to partner with diverse organizations, and just to kind of, even if it's just a question of people meeting people, and maybe if there isn't like a direct partnership that you can do together, you can start building these relationships. And I think that just makes for healthier, more vibrant kind of vasculatory systems of our sphere.
I love that about the vasculatory system, because I think people get inspired, especially if you collaborate with unlikely collaborators at the end of the day. I think that's kind of, America needs more of that. And so, I love kind of reaching out to groups that people would not expect PERC to partner with, to try to find that thing where we can have sort of mutual respect, and we can disagree in a whole bunch of areas, but where we can convince ourselves that, like, hey, there's a really sound way of moving forward here, where we can come think more like PERC, and PERC can be open-minded. It's a good thing. We're partnering with a group here in Bozeman called the Greater Yellowstone Coalition. And historically speaking, they were a little bit like Environmental Defense Fund. They sort of got their roots in litigation and regulation. But I think over the years, they've come to really recognize the value of private ranches and farmlands out here and in the Yellowstone area, and recognizing also that kind of heavy-handed government penalizes those folks, and it doesn't make allies with ranchers. So we have big elk migrations that come out of Yellowstone, and the elk migrations start in the high country on public land, but they end in the wintertime on private ranch land along the rivers, which are lower in elevation, and grass is available there. And the elk just sort of love hanging out of these ranches. And it's a problem for the ranchers because the elk bring a disease that cause the cattle to abort their fetuses. And it's called brucellosis. And if a cow-calf operation gets brucellosis, it can, a rancher has to go into quarantine with his cattle. It can cost them $150,000 a year. A group like Greater Yellowstone Coalition has partnered with PERC, and we just created Montana's first elk occupancy agreement, first one in the state, where we're actually, the Greater Yellowstone Coalition and PERC are going to pay for a fence that will separate cattle from elk, and the ranchers essentially giving a portion of their ranch to the elk and saying, like, we will keep our cattle away. Elk, you get this part of the ranch. Cattle, we get this part of the ranch. So there's actually like a conservation benefit, and all they needed to do that was to somebody to come and help them pay and finance the fence so that they could manage their property, both for conservation and both for cattle as well.
Well, that's interesting. So, in the vein of getting the folks over at the Greater Yellowstone Project to recognize, the value in working with private ranchers, you also, in a recent testimony that you gave before the House Natural Resources Committee, observed that only 13% of rural Americans trusts environmental groups as sources of information for conservation issues, making such groups actually the least trusted of the 13 options. So it wasn't just like 13 out of 20, it was 13 out of 13. So, that's an incentive. If those groups look at poll numbers like that, hey, maybe if we're going to try to have some more progress here, we need to try to shepherd these relationships. The same testimony you talked about, only 25% of rural Americans believing the federal government should lead on conservation. So what's driving that dramatic lack of trust in environmental groups and a lack of confidence in the federal government on these issues?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's a complex answer at the end of the day. I think number one is that ranchers and farmers, I don't think, they're not getting credit for being the good stewards that they are to our land right now. We have 900 million acres of farms and ranches in the United States, and just because a rancher isn't in a government program, and just because a rancher hasn't put a conservation easement on their land, doesn't mean that that land isn't conservation land. I look at the cattle ranches out here and some of the most spectacular country out here, and ranchers will do rotational grazing. So cattle won't intensively graze one area. They'll move those herds around, which leads to healthy grasslands on their ranches. That doesn't count as conservation. In our world, if it's not government or it's not a conservation easement covered up by a legal document, it doesn't count. So we have to rethink what conservation means going forward in the 21st century. And we have to be more open-minded to say, these working private lands, we just need them to keep doing what they're doing, and that should count towards conservation. So that's one point. The second point I'd say is a term, and it's a little loaded, but environmental colonialism is the term. Yeah. And really where we saw this initially was Africa, right, where you have wildlife issues in Africa, villagers where there are elephants and rhinos and lions that were actually a negative cost to villages, trampling crops, potentially endangering villagers. And so they essentially were letting poachers kind of come in and really harm the wildlife in Africa. But once folks figured out a way to make wildlife an asset for villagers in Africa, to get a cut of, say, trophy hunting revenue to come in, all of a sudden that wildlife became an asset, and they could move economies from, say, agriculture to tourism and big game hunting, which actually was reliant on more population, having more elephants, having more rhinos and stuff, and populations rebounded. Well, the conservation groups that are the Western conservation groups were out there, trying to reverse this. They're trying to do trophy hunting bans and things that actually would have a negative consequence, and they're doing it from afar. So here's Africa. A lot of these countries have figured out how to do conservation in a market-based way that works for wildlife, that works for the villagers. And you have these foreign environmental organizations trying to undo policy or trying to dictate from afar. That looks a lot like colonialism, right? That was the definition of colonialism. America has a little bit of that too. I think, real or perception, that rural communities in America are kind of being dictated to by federal government, bureaucrats in the federal bureaucracy, probably well-meaning, but it comes across as, what do these folks know? And environmental groups that tend to be based in the cities on the coast, and not in rural America. So it's another form of environmental colonialism that's kind of happening right here in our backyard. And it goes to the third point, which would be, one of the great economists was Friedrich Hayek. And Hayek wrote about the knowledge problem, and that all knowledge is localized and dispersed, right? And fragmented. And so it kind of defies central planning. Like if knowledge is out there in the hinterlands and in these individual river basins, in places in Montana and local communities in Montana, how are you going to centrally plan conservation? How are you going to centrally plan land management when all the knowledge is there? You can't possibly have a bureaucrat who knows all of that. So solutions need to be locally driven. They need to be flexible and adaptable. And that doesn't come from big government top-down edicts or from conservation organizations kind of driving that. And I think that is really at the heart of where you see this tension between rural communities and the federal government and environmental groups. At the top of the list of who they trust at the end of the day are other ranchers and farmers. Well, yeah, they're the ones with knowledge. They're your next door neighbor. They're telling you, I see elk over here. I don't see elk over here. I saw the elk cross the river. I didn't see the elk cross the river. So,
yeah, wow. So we've talked a little bit about the switch on the Keystone pipeline. Another big signature policy initiative is Biden's 30 by 30 executive order, which is talking about conserving 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. So first of all, maybe just speak to that initiative. What the problem or the trend that 30 by 30 is seeking to address, or is it simply seeking to build on previous progress? And you'd also mentioned that the order references conserving, not protecting or preserving. And why is that word choice important?
Yeah, well, so it's good. This is the Biden administration's top environmental initiative, and you described it accurately. And it's definitely a work in progress. Like there's still, if there's criticism, people are like, well, what does it mean? Or what are you counting towards 30%? Or what are you not counting towards 30%? And people are apoplectic about that. What we do know is, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, 12% of the land mass in the United States is preserved and protected already, right? So that at a minimum is a baseline. So if you got to get an additional 18% of preserved and protected land, that's something like 440 million acres. So that's 4 Californias that you have to protect. The interesting thing is they didn't, in the report that kind of launched this, they didn't use the word preserve or protect, they used the word conserve. And if you're in this field, that is a big, big difference than preserve and protect. And I like to think, I don't know, I'm not behind the scenes in the Biden administration. I do have friends in there that I get to talk to from time to time. And I think there's a little bit of tug of war between the progressives, sort of hardline environmentalists, and the moderate, more reasonable conservationists out there. And when it's come to 30 by 30, it appears that the more moderate conservation folks have prevailed. To actually go in and protect and preserve would essentially mean creating more national parks, more wilderness areas, more areas where use of the land is restricted and curtailed. Conserve is totally different. So conserve pulls in national forests, private forests, state forests. Conserve pulls in private ranches, private farms. Conserve pulls in the Bureau of Land Management. Conserve implies multiple use. You can still ranch and farm on this and it can be conserved. You can still hunt and fish on this land and it can still be conserved. You can still do forestry on this land and it can be conserved. If conserve is the metric, you might be at 30% already. If you start pulling our national forests or state forests or certain private lands that aren't in easements, you might find yourself already at 30%. So, what counts and how this counts going forward is a really big deal. The issue they're trying to address is biodiversity, right? And biodiversity is this big concept of everything is intertwined in life. It's everything from genes to species to entire ecosystems, and the linkage. We have oxygen because we have plants because we have pollinators. All of that's intertwined. So how do you protect biodiversity? And there was a very famous ecologist, he's still alive, named E.O. Wilson, who's from my part of the South where I came from, who was saying that we should protect half the planet. Like half the planet should be set aside to protect biodiversity. The interesting thing is, if you look at biodiversity in the United States, right? People think like, okay, biodiversity, let's go out in the West and just declare something, 50,000 acres, 100,000 acres in the West and, give it a designation and make it conservation. Most of the biodiversity in the United States is in the Southeast, actually. So if you're going out and trying to count wilderness areas or Bear's Ear as biodiversity conservation, it's not that. The biodiversity hotspots, according to science, are in the Southeast. And guess what? The Southeast is all privately owned. So 10,000 acres in the West might mean less than 100 acres in the Southeast somewhere, where you do have a lot of biological diversity there. So it's going to be interesting to watch how the administration goes about this, because the low-hanging fruit is just to go out West and take more land and designate it or declare it something, which will be divisive. Whereas in the the biodiversity gains that would occur is going to mean dealing with private landowners in the Southeast United States and how to encourage more conservation there. And it's not going to be the regulatory route that's going to work in the Southeast. You're going to have to be more creative. And that's where markets are going to come in. That's where property rights are going to come in. It's going to be ground zero for some of these conversations, which we're pretty excited about, I think.
So we just have about 5 more minutes. And you mentioned Hayek. Of course, I know you also have an Ayn Rand story to share from your time working for Jeb Bush. So
Yeah, I'll share. It's kind of fun. So I came to Ayn Rand a little bit late in life. I think in my 30s. I was working for Governor Jeb Bush. It was his first term in office, and Jeb Bush was a notorious. I think Jennifer, we were saying all the Bushes were notorious regifters. So somebody would give them a gift, and then they would wrap it up and give it back to you as a Christmas present. And the Christmas present from Jeb Bush to me one year was Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. And that was my first experience reading Ayn Rand. And I became a huge fan and gobbled up all the other books. And so when Jeb was terming out as governor, he'd done 8 years as governor, as one of the tributes to him, a lot of his friends and donors came together and decided they were going to build a library at the governor's mansion where he had resided for all future governors to use. And Jeb Bush and Barbara Bush were so big on literacy. It was just a very appropriate thing. And in his very last day in office, me and a bunch of fellow Ayn Rand fans out there got a copy of The Fountainhead, and we inscribed it. I think we inscribed it to all the creators and innovators out there, and we snuck it into the library and put it up on the bookshelf there. And there have been successive governors that have come since Jeb Bush. Charlie Crist was a governor. Rick Scott was a governor. Ron DeSantis is the governor now. And every time I go back there for an event, I sneak into the library, and there is The Fountainhead, exactly where I left it back in 2008. So,
well, good. I'm glad to hear it. I hope people are reading it and taking its message of individualism and freedom to heart. So, Brian, where can we learn more about your work? Where is the best place to follow your thoughts and some of the leading lights at your institute?
Yeah, we do. So we have Twitter, we have Facebook. Our website is www.perc.org. It's a really cool website if you like environmental things. It's beautiful. We have a Instagram account. Our handle's at PERC Conserves. And we're very fortunate because in the sort of the free market movement, there are a lot of organizations that deal with healthcare and education and tax policy and all these other areas. We're one of the few, if not the only one, that gets to deal with environment and conservation, which means we have the coolest Instagram account in the whole movement right now. So we get to post pictures of really fascinating things. We just, the elk issue I was telling about, we just posted a movie, a 10-minute short film on Instagram that talks about this work with ranchers and private landowners in Montana and the challenges they have with elk, which is already making it into film festivals. So I'd encourage folks to go and take a look at that. It's kind of the newest, freshest thing we have out there.
Great. Well, and given that you're on Instagram in the spirit of partnership and cross-pollination, we've invited Brian to do one of our Instagram takeovers, and we are anticipating some very beautiful backdrops for that. So thank you, Brian. Thanks for all of the work you do, and thanks for chatting with us today here on the Atlas Society Asks.
This has been fun. It's been an honor. It's been fun, and appreciate everything you guys do. And like I said, great to reconnect with a 41 alumni from 30 years ago.
I know, it's amazing. Looking forward to the next.
Well, come to Montana. Come visit us.
I will. My parents were just there, and we need to invite you also to the San Francisco Flycasters Club.
Oh yeah.
Truckee, California, where my dad's a member and where we fish. So, well,
tell your dad PERC is steeped in fly fishing history. The owner of Sims Fishing is on our board, and the former chairman of Orvis, a guy named Lee Perkins, was on our board for 28 years. So we have fly fishing royalty that is part of the PERC board of directors going back decades.
Well, I'm going to get you together with Dad because he's got a couple of other friends, Yvonne Schoenard, who may favor a little bit more of a regulatory approach. But
I'll get him to come around.
I'm sure you will. So thank you, Brian. Thanks all of you who joined us for this interview. Make sure to tune in next week. We're going to have our monthly current events. And for those of you who enjoy these forums and are enjoying the work of the Atlas Society, then please consider making a tax-deductible donation to our organization. Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Jennifer.